This week's episode of Astonishing Legends is supported in part by the Great Courses Plus, Squarespace, and ZipRecruiter.
And we're back.
Give the people what they want, I guess.
The people want me to say, and we're back.
So be it.
What's on the menu this evening, sir?
All right, what are you doing now?
Well, that's from Train Spotting.
Should have recognized. It's been a while
You
since
should
I saw
have,
that.
yeah.
Well, there's a fair amount on the menu tonight. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to all the folks who came out to the first Astonishing Meetup in New York City on February 26th. You know who you are. You guys really made my night. It was such a great crowd, and meeting listeners for the first time was a wonderful experience, made better by how cool you folks are. All walks of life, age ranges, and interests. It was just a real thrill, especially hearing some of your creepy stories, including the ones, which was most of them, that you won't let me retell on the air. I was a little surprised we had no Men in Black or Devils in the Diner, but I think it's just as well. And next time, Forrest, you have got to be there.
Well, I would if I thought the thing was real. I'm not sure that actually happened, any of it. It could have been just a bunch of people all culled together in some kind of flash mob to chisel some free drinks out of a Manhattan bar or something. I wouldn't put that past you. So.
Oh, well, first of all, the drinks weren't free. I see that you're trying to make it was like the moon landing.
Right.
We all paid for our drinks. But,
that's good.
Next time, maybe if the show's doing better. But here's the thing that you should know. A lot of people don't think you're real. So
Well, then mission accomplished, because that's exactly the vibe I'm trying to put out there. But what other news do we have?
Well, our new Squarespace website is up, so check it out. Our store is back online as well. We're still ironing out a few minor kinks, including international shipping rates, which right now it says something crazy. Just email the store and we'll get it sorted out. We have our good friend Craig from Abnormal Allies is taking care of all our fulfillment there, and he'll be happy to help you if you have any questions about trying to place an order. Just email the store contact email address there. We're going to get all that sorted out with the shipping rates, and we have some layout tweaks to make to the site overall, but it's pretty much there. The site is looking really good.
Yes, and we are working on some cool new merchandise for the store as well, so keep an eye on things the next few weeks. Okay, so speaking of the greatest trick the devil ever pulled by making the world believe he didn't exist, have you heard anything from our dear Count of St. Germain?
Indeed, I have. He's been in touch, and tonight, the Count, known in his current iteration as talented actor, comedian, writer, producer, author, and director Kevin Pollak, has come back on the show to announce the winner of the contest to determine what profession his new persona should be when he decides the Kevin Pollak thing has run its course.
Okay, well, excellent. I'm going to play back your conversation with him right now.
All right, so we're back here with Kevin Pollak, also known as the Count of St. Germain, which we managed to figure out through careful research and photographic comparisons. And you guys may remember that when he was last on the show, he invited you to come up with some suggestions for the next iteration of the Count when he decides to retire the Kevin Pollak mantle. So, Kevin, I trust you've had a chance to look over what all the listeners sent in.
Oh, yes, I have.
All right. So how are you feeling about the entries there? Did you find one that was a favorite for you?
Well, that's a relative question. I felt that much of the efforts on the part of the fans were fantastic. But the few exceptions, I don't want to say there's a few apples that spoil the entire barrel or bunch or otherwise known container. But man, oh man, did people go out of their way to spoil them. There were only a few spoilers, and I shunned them. I will not acknowledge them. I will say try again. There were several that delighted me, but unfortunately we can only pick one winner, shall we say?
All right.
Is that a thing?
Yeah, that's a thing. It's a winner.
Yeah. All right. Where is this wonderful, wonderful email? You know, there are a lot of very flowery descriptions, and then this person, AJ Sanchez, had one simple sentence. I mean, there are paragraphs upon paragraphs that people wrote, and I want to thank most of them for their efforts. But AJ Sanchez simply wrote, and should I read it now?
Yes, please do.
Since the Count is immortal, I would like to see him be a stuntman. Now, not only is this a winner, but it is, in fact, what I've decided to do.
Excellent. So next time around, you'll still be able to make films, but maybe you'll be able to do something a little more exciting.
I think it's time I get out of the limelight, was what AJ Sanchez was suggesting, and I took it to heart.
Excellent. All right. So, AJ, you will be getting an autographed copy of Kevin's book, How I Slept My Way to the Middle. So we'll
That's
get you.
right. That's right. And if the stuntman ever writes a book, it will be how I slept my way off of any marquee and or one sheet.
Do you have any feel for when you're going to wrap up your current persona and maybe make this reappearance?
I feel like I got another good 10 years in me. So I might have to stay in the groove, as it were, for another 10 years. I just got a green light on the next film for me to direct.
Excellent.
I'm sure I mentioned the one I recently directed, The Late Bloomer, is currently available on Netflix, but if not there, I mentioned it.
Yes.
I kind of want to dig this directing groove a little bit longer, but I am taking it to heart. I am applauding the effort of AJ Sanchez, and I am following his instructions. Well, it could be her. I don't know. AJ Sanchez could easily be her.
That's
Him,
good.
her. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the idea of the contest and taking a look at all of these suggestions. We really appreciate your coming on the show and being so honest about the fact that you actually are the Count of Saint Germain. It's going to put a longstanding mystery to rest, or as we like to say, we've solved it.
You did solve it, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your efforts, your fans' efforts to help me relieve myself of this endless burden that has finally come to an end. And you'll get AJ's mailing address and all that to handle the book. I want to make sure that he or she gets the book right away.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Thanks a lot, Kevin, and congrats on your new project. That's awesome.
Thanks very much. And again, thank you and all of your fans for your relief. I really do appreciate it. It's been a hell of a burden through many lifetimes. Man, I didn't realize this was going to be so glaringly obvious with a side-by-side comparison. Otherwise, I might have changed things a little bit more. I may have to go with some sort of stuntman who's disfigured in the face.
Yeah.
So that this sort of thing doesn't come around again.
Yes, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. All right. Well, thanks very much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
Miami radio couldn't find us on radar, and my dad grabbed the microphone from me and he started screaming at the guy. What the hell do you mean you don't know our position? We just got this brand new transponder installed. Pilot Bruce Gernon's dad to air traffic control at Miami International Airport after they'd flown through an anomaly of some kind.
Join us tonight as we take a look at a bizarre phenomenon known as electronic fog. All right. Okay. So when this story took place, I was about a year old.
Yeah, that makes sense.
December 1970.
Experiencing normal time
Yes.
Perceptions, yes.
Yes. And this is a fascinating story to me. This is one we've been wanting to do for a while. This is the story of a pilot named Bruce Gernon, who actually just one day prior to when this took place, he had been attending a memorial service dedicated to the lost pilots of the famous Bermuda Triangle disappearance of Flight 19.
Also famously recreated or mystery solved in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yes, that's
Sort
right.
of. Yeah, right.
That's
But
right.
I love that opening scene where they start up the planes that were missing.
Yes.
Like they had just been landed there. You know, he mentioned the date, in the interview we had just now, but it didn't really fully sink in. It's like, wow, 25 years, almost to the day.
Yeah, this event took place one day before the 25th anniversary of the disappearance of Flight 19, and it took place more or less in the same part of the world.
Right. But,
also known as the Bermuda Triangle.
One corner of it, yes.
So on that day, he and his father had flown to the Bahamas because they were real estate investors, and they had a partner on board named Chuck Lafayette. And they were due to return back from the island of Andros in the Bahamas in their brand new Beechcraft Bonanza A-36 plane. Now, Bruce is an experienced pilot. At this point, he was only about 20-something years old. He was in the prime of his life, and his father was also a licensed pilot.
Yeah, his father was the senior pilot, kind of guiding him, but Bruce had full control of the plane and was very well trusted by his dad, who was acting as navigator at the time.
That's right. So they took off from Andros Island, and they were planning to fly directly towards Bimini and then to Palm Beach International Airport, which was their final destination. So on this trip back from Andros Island, they encountered a strange storm, which Bruce wound up calling a time storm, where they entered a tunnel, which he will describe very accurately here in a moment, And as they emerged from the other side of the tunnel, they were 30 minutes ahead of schedule and 80 miles closer to where they thought they should be based on their charts and navigation.
Which, by what we know, should be impossible.
And the great thing about Bruce is he was a young man at the time in his 20s. He kept a chart. He documented everything that happened because he knew that it was important. And we have that chart, and we will be sharing it with our listeners as a link. I'm actually have pulled it into Photoshop to highlight some areas, and it will help you follow along at home, kids, while you listen to this interview. So if you're not in a car doing your commute or on the subway, or you hear this part before you go, print this thing out. You should take a look at it because it's very interesting. For me anyway, I'm kind of a map person, to look at it as he's telling the story. But the chart will show you just how crazy it is, what happened to him, and everything is very well documented. So tonight we're going to talk to Bruce himself about what happened from his point of view. He was in his 20s at the time. He's a bit older now, but he has been obsessed with this story himself ever since then. Something similar even happened to him again later in life when he was flying with his wife, and he'll talk about that some as well.
All right, then, let's get to the interview.
Hello, this is Bruce Gernon. I'm going to give some information for Scott. Appreciate him having me on. I'm going on 71 years old now, so I'm like semi-retired, and I've been a pilot ever since I was 17. But just recently, I'm not flying much as I used to. I've been active all those years, but now my eyes are starting to bother me a little bit. My vision not being nearly as good as it was when I was young. When I was young, my vision was 20/10 when I had this experience in the Bermuda Triangle, so I could see things that most people weren't able to see at that time. So over the years, I've studied construction and have degrees in building construction, and I studied physical science and physics in college. Recently, I got my master boat captain's license, so I've been doing more boating instead of flying. I sold my last airplane, owned 7 of them over the years, but I've owned a lot more boats than that. So that's keeping me busy, but my passion has been the research of the Bermuda Triangle ever since 1970 when I had this experience while returning from Andros Island in the Bahamas, returning to Palm Beach, Florida. I had an incredible experience, so I spent a lot of time memorizing it because I knew someday it may be important for all the world to know about. And so now it's become my passion to study and keep researching. It's a great mystery, still a great mystery, not recognized by mainstream science yet. So it's kind of a challenge for me to pursue my research, but I know that someday this will be recognized by mainstream science. Back in the early 1970s, I used to do a lot of flying in the Bahamas. Well, actually, it was starting in the mid-60s when I first started going there. I went there about once a month with my dad. We were business partners in construction development, and we were planning on building a resort on one of the Bahama islands. So we would fly to the Bahamas, and we checked out almost every major island in the Bahamas in search of some good real estate. My dad seemed to like Andros Island the most, so we made a deal with the English Parliament back then. They were going to give us this island called Big Wood Key, which was right in the middle of Andros. If we developed it, they would let us have the island. So it was a heck of a deal, so we were in the process of purchasing the island, and we would fly there. About once a week we'd go there, making preparations to the resort. It was on this day of 1970, December 4th, when we were returning from there. We had spent the night there, and I was flying our airplane. I was the chief pilot, my dad was the licensed pilot, but he was the co-pilot. And we had a business partner with us, Chuck Lafayette. So there were 3 of us, and we had planned on leaving first thing in the morning from the airport at Andros. Was called Fresh Creek. It's pretty much in the middle of Andros, near the tongue of the ocean, the deep water offshore. And that's where Altec has a Navy base there also. And that's known as a mysterious area. They call it the Underwater Area 51.
Oh, really? I'm going to have to read up on it. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting area where they experiment with their submarines, and it's top secret. We couldn't leave in the morning because there was rain. It wasn't a lightning storm, but it was a rainstorm. And the rain was like medium intensity, steady. So visibility was probably only about a mile. And so we decided we'd wait it out. Well, back then, we couldn't get any weather reports on that island. They didn't even have a phone on the whole island back then. We have modern weather reports that my friend, the scientist, David Paris, has discovered that showed that the weather was clear in between Andros and Florida, but over Andros, the entire island was covered with a large rainstorm. It finally started to let up early in the afternoon, so we got ready to head out, and we went to the airport, and we actually lifted off at exactly 3 p.m. I noted that with my watch right on liftoff. We climbed to 1,000 feet because the ceiling was about 1,500 feet, so we had to stay under the storm. It was still a light sprinkle when we were taking off.
How far is the island from where you were flying to?
We were flying direct to Bimini and then direct to Palm Beach International Airport, which would be 210 miles. The flight that we took, though, ended up to be more like 250 miles because we had to do 4 deviations.
Okay.
We couldn't fly direct because of what we encountered.
Man, how cool is our new website?
Pretty darn cool, I gotta say. But after looking through some of Squarespace's templates last year, I knew our image was about to get an upgrade.
You know, our original website was pretty cool, but as the show grew and more people began to visit it, there was no question we needed something better. So we decided to make our next move with Squarespace. And now our website is epic.
It really has become next level. Not only does it look better, it's easier to manage, right?
Much. It's actually been hard for me to put into words how thrilled I am with the new Squarespace setup. There's so much great stuff about it. I couldn't figure out what to say in this spot. For example, working with ad agencies for years, I became a design snob by osmosis.
Translation, nitpicky jerk.
Yeah, I guess so. But the award-winning designer templates Squarespace has just look amazing. Not only are they beautiful, elegant, and leading edge design-wise, they're super dynamic, automatically adjusting themselves for various mobile platforms, and they couldn't be easier to work with on the back end. I love that we can now embed video loops in our headers, and that all the graphics are perfect executions of flat design, which is where everything is heading visually these days.
They also seem to know what you want before you do. For example, we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could add a calendar of events? And after about a 15-second search on the Squarespace backend, there it was. And within a couple of clicks, it was live.
5 minutes after that, I had show release dates plugged in with cool pictures and rollover pop-up descriptions. I would have spent days trying to execute that on our old website, but with Squarespace, it was pretty much done before we even had the idea.
Which allows us to focus on the next pressing thing, so we have more time to work on the show and manage our business.
And Squarespace's 24/7 customer support is also award-winning, and they're fully transparent, easy to set up, all-in-one platform means there's nothing for you to install, patch, or upgrade ever. They take care of the complicated stuff for you.
Don't wait to make your next move. Get your own unique domain name before someone else does and make your own beautiful website with Squarespace.
Make your next beautiful website now. Use the promo code LEGENDS at checkout for 10% off any website subscription or domain purchase at squarespace.com.
That promo code again is LEGENDS. Squarespace. Make your next move.
Forrest and Scott, thank you for supporting their sponsors. I'm Ian Ulam, now back to the show.
Okay, at this time, you might wish to refer to your charts. Unless, of course, you're driving, please do not, texting is bad enough, please do not be looking at an aeronautical chart.
No, and if you, especially if you print it out on giant blueprint-sized sheets here.
That's what I would do. I would be pulling over on the side of the road. All right, let's roll this out on the hood.
I see. It looks like in the movies where you got your light table and your grease pencils and your protractors and all that.
Yeah, the Star Wars. They got the clear plastic board.
You do the clear plastic ones, but there's a reason for that. So you can clearly see where you're going. That's why it's so important when you see that in submarine movies and naval battle movies to chart where you're going. So Bruce has generously given his where he's charted everything. So that's kind of why, if you're following along in this story, to go to the website or take a look at this chart that we're offering.
It only appears in one other place on the internet, so we were lucky to get a hold of it.
Yeah. When you look at this map, it shows clearly where he left from Andros Island and where exactly the outer ring of this electronic fog phenomenon starts to happen and just the distances he had to go.
And he's going to get more specific about what he encountered later, but one thing that you will notice on the chart, and it's very clearly indicated, and also I've highlighted it to make it a little easier to read in Photoshop, but you will see how his course was heading straight for Bimini, and about halfway between Andros and Bimini, he turned due south for a short time, 3 minutes actually, before turning back on course towards Miami International Airport, which I'd like to point out the airport abbreviation for Miami International Airport is MIA.
Missing in action.
I mean, it's the corner of the Bermuda Triangle here, people.
Well, yes, I'm sure they don't like to think about that aspect of it.
Yeah. So anyway, he turns south for 3 minutes, and then he turns back to the northwest, more west than north, to get towards MIA. And you can see on the chart exactly where he's going. So if you have any difficulty following this visually as he's talking about it, definitely take a look at the chart later when you can, or if you're able to look at it while you're listening to the show. It's one of the first times we've had a visual aid that goes along with the actual program.
Right. That is clearly helpful.
Yeah.
Sure.
All right. Let's get back to the interview.
So we stayed over the island at 1,000 feet, and then we reached the western shoreline of the island. We were stationed on the eastern shoreline, and the island's like 40 miles wide. And as we approached the ocean, which is the area of the Great Bahama Bank, I could see that the storm was ending. Apparently it was just over the main island of Andros, and it looked nice and clear out over the Great Bahama Bank. Then I noticed there was a strange cloud hovering over the ocean. It was only maybe 500 feet above the ocean, and it looked like a lenticular cloud. That's a cloud that usually forms only at high altitudes and has smooth edges. And this cloud was maybe a mile long and 1,000 feet thick and quarter mile wide. It looked harmless, and it was just hovering right there, really. There wasn't much wind that day, though. Winds were light and variable. It looked like it wouldn't be a problem, but it was directly in front of our flight path, which was direct to Bimini, and we were using our electronic instruments and the compass to go direct to Bimini.
What was your aircraft?
It was a brand new, really beautiful Bonanza Beechcraft A36, which is still in production today. The airframe is identical to the 1970 model that we had. Of course, there's a lot of technological improvements that you really can't be seen until you take a really good look at it. But mostly inside it, the basic airframe is still the same. It's a classic airplane. And we climbed up over this cloud, thinking it would be no problem. So I started ascending from 1,000 feet, and I planned on going to 10,500 feet and leveling off. As we climbed up over the storm, it wasn't a storm, it was just a lenticular type of cloud. At the time, I really didn't have time to think about it being an unusual cloud, because normally you never see a cloud like that at a low altitude. As I got up to a few thousand feet, I was able to contact Miami on the radio and file our flight plan. And I got a weather report, and they said it was clear in between Andros Island and Miami. But there were a few large scattered storms over the shoreline of Florida and inland over the Everglades. So that sounded okay. And after I finished filing the flight plan, I looked out and checked out this cloud that we had flown over, and it was completely different than what it was like when I went over it. So I don't know if I triggered this cloud to do this by the vibrations of the airplane or what, or just a coincidence. I thought that maybe I had just flown over the birth of a cumulonimbus thunderstorm that is known to be able to develop quite rapidly.
What was the position of the cloud at this point when you noticed that it had changed relative to your aircraft?
It was a few miles offshore of Andros Island over the Great Bahama Bank.
But behind you?
Well, no, it was in front of me.
Oh, okay.
When I first saw it. And then I went and climbed up over it.
Right.
I didn't study it very closely while I was climbing over it because I was busy filing the flight plan. So then when I finished that, I looked around me and I couldn't believe what I'm seeing here. It's like, what's going on? This cloud is building up and at the same pace that we're climbing, and we're climbing at 1,000 feet per minute.
Right. So it's all around you at this point when you're noticing this change.
Yeah, it's below me.
Okay.
And so then I keep climbing up to 6,000 or more, and then it catches up to me, and the airplane goes inside the cloud. And it looked like a typical cloud with very low visibility, only 100 feet or so, just a pure white area. But apparently it's building up rapidly, so what would happen is it gave the plane a boost of air, like a cushion, that boosted us up, and we'd break free of the cloud. So then I'd get maybe 200 or 300 feet above the cloud, and then start to settle down again after that boost, and then the cloud would catch up to me again, and I'd go back inside the cloud. This went on maybe 4 or 5 times, and when we got to like 11,000 feet, my dad suggested that we turn around and go back to Andros.
How many miles were you from Andros at this point?
Well, at this point, we'd be about 50 miles or so, between 40 to 50 miles.
Were you guys concerned yet? Were you having a discussion about it in the plane?
I don't remember discussing that much until my dad started making the suggestion that we turn around. Then we started talking. I didn't want to do it because that would mean that I'd have to fly back through this cloud, and I'd probably end up being in it instead of above it. And I wouldn't be able to get too high because we didn't have oxygen.
How high could you go before that was a concern?
Well, I could go up to maybe 15,000, but then I couldn't stay at 15,000 long at all. Just only a few minutes. And I'd have to come back down to under 12,000 to be legal.
Okay.
I told Dad, okay, maybe we're going to do it. Just give me a little more time. And then when we got to 11,500 feet, we broke free of the storm. I leveled off. We're in clear air again. And I look around me, and I can't believe what I'm looking at. This storm, it wasn't a storm, but it is now. The cloud had expanded, and it turned into not just a cumulonimbus isolated thunderstorm. It was a huge squall. As far as I could see, on either side of me, visibility of about 10 miles, that would be a total of 20 miles, I could see this curved squall behind the aircraft. And I noticed it was kind of unusual because it was curved so perfectly. But I didn't think about it too long because I was relieved that we broke free, put the plane on autopilot, leveled off, and kind of sat back and relaxed, took a deep breath and was, really happy now, cruising at 11,500.
Sure.
I kept it at that altitude while we cruised. I really didn't think about that storm that we had just experienced. But thinking back many years later, probably after I thought about it and researched it, it was like I was climbing at 1,000 feet per minute, but I didn't realize that the storm was rapidly expanding so fast. It's incredible because I was going at a forward speed of 105 miles an hour, and this storm was going faster than that. I never got ahead of it.
Right.
It was spreading out faster forward of me than 105 miles an hour, but also it was spreading out laterally on either side of me at an incredible rate. It's something like, I estimate, maybe 300 miles an hour.
Wow.
How fast it was spreading out. But it wouldn't be a 300 mile an hour wind. It would be more like a 300 mile an hour ignition of this cloud igniting and spreading out. Kind of like if you took a gasoline and poured a circle of gas, and then you lit one end, spread out at a rapid rate to the other end. Never thought of that. How fast would that spread be if you did that with gasoline? Would it be close to 300 miles an hour?
Oh, that's a good question. We have a research group, and we have somebody in it who we can probably find that out. He particularly likes setting things on fire, so we can maybe we can find that out.
There could be a relationship with that ratio of speed of ignition. So I call this storm a time storm, or the mother storm, that can create the tunnel vortex and electronic fog. So anyway, I'm cruising now at 195 miles an hour. I had been flying for 10 minutes while I was ascending.
Since you left Andros?
20 minutes since I left Andros.
Okay.
I flew for another 6 minutes at 11,500 feet. But when I got about 10 miles or less, in front of me I see the other side of this storm. I didn't know it was connected for sure because I didn't see the whole storm. But apparently it was. And I'm looking in front of me now, and here's this storm that had perfectly curved edges forming like a semicircle. Only now it's facing in front of me instead of behind me. And now it had built up to maybe 50,000 feet high. I also noticed that it was laying right on the surface of the ocean. It had no ceiling like a normal cloud. So I couldn't fly over it and I couldn't fly under it. And I'm using instruments to fly direct to Bimini this whole time. And so I maintained course and went ahead and penetrated into it. The visibility wasn't that bad. I felt like I could have gone on until the lightning flashes started shooting off, really intense lightning flashes. They weren't lightning bolts, but they were flashes, and the deeper I penetrated into the storm, the more intense they became. It's almost like day and night at one point, and that's when I decided that it was just too intense. I made a sharp turn to the left, started heading due south. See, I had been heading on a northwest heading.
Sure.
And so I turned left and then popped back out of the cloud into the clear opening. And right at that time, contacted the Miami radio again and told them my situation, told them I had encountered a squall and I had deviated from my flight path, and I was about 45 miles east of Miami when I made that deviation. And then I was going to see if I could fly around the edge of this storm. So I'm heading south for a couple of minutes, and then I see that the storm was still in front of me. I'm looking at the curve again, and now it's still south of me. So then I realized, oh, wait a minute, this storm is like a giant donut-shaped storm.
It's all around you.
Yeah, it's all around me. So I couldn't fly around it, trapped in the center of it. So then I noticed where two ends had met each other. They were on the opposite end of where the storm had formed. So it's like back to that gasoline thing where it connects on the other end.
Sure.
I saw it connect on the bottom first. So then there was like a big valley, like a U-shaped valley on the top. And so I figured I'll head for that and shoot through this valley because that would take me right to South Florida, Miami area.
You're flying south at this point, and this was off to the west a little bit, or the southwest?
That's right. It was off to the west.
Okay. And that looked like a safe place to try to get through, or the safest place you could pick anyway.
Yeah, or the only place. And so I'd been flying for 2 minutes, 3 minutes. So I talked with my dad, and we discussed it about flying through the opening, and so he agreed that it would be a good idea.
How's Mr. Lafayette doing at this point? Is he calm?
Yeah, he's doing good.
Okay, good.
I start aiming for the opening, and then these two big anvil heads form, one on each side of that valley I was telling you about. And then the anvil heads connect on the top. So now it's formed a horizontal tunnel in between the storm. And the storm looked like it was about 10 miles wide, the squall. So now there's like a 10-mile long tunnel going through the storm. It was huge at first. I figured, well, there'd still be plenty of time. So I noticed it was a little bit lower than us. We were at 11,500, and so the center of the tunnel was right at 10,000 feet. I started diving down, and then I realized that it seemed to be closing kind of fast. So I took it to maximum power to the red line at 220 miles an hour and aimed right for the center of the tunnel. And it took me about a minute to get there. I've been flying 10 minutes over Andros, 10 minutes of climbing, 6 minutes to level off.
And you're referencing your chart now.
Yeah, 3 minutes heading south, 1 minute to enter the mouth, so that's 30 minutes. I've been flying 30 minutes when I enter the tunnel, and I'm about almost 100 miles southeast of Miami, over the Great Bahama Bank. And when I entered the tunnel, it had reduced its size to less than 1,000 feet, maybe 600-800 feet. I really kind of miscalculated about flying through it because 10 miles would take me like 3 minutes to get out of the other end of the tunnel. It was closing rapidly.
Was there lightning around you? Not in the tunnel, but around the edges?
No, I didn't notice any. You know, I had already penetrated into it. At 10,000 feet, there was incredible electricity going on. When I entered the mouth of the tunnel, something incredible happened. No one's really figured it out yet. Why these strange lines formed within the tunnel. And what formed the lines were these small puffs of cloud. And each cloud was varied in size a little bit, but they were most of them about the size of, say, like a small bus. Why that happened is something that's incredible, whatever it was. I'll never forget that event. It happened instantly. The airplane penetrated the tunnel. What I believe I was seeing was the fabric of space-time.
Can you be clearer on what the lines exactly looked like? Were they stripes?
Yeah, well, it was like but they were curved. And it was like looking down a rifle barrel.
Uh-huh.
Like on the movie, remember?
Yes,
James Bond?
yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, sure.
They had a huge rifle barrel opening scenes, tiny little hole that you're looking through in a rifle barrel. They had this huge rifle barrel. Well, yeah, the lines were very similar to that, but they were like broken up, though. They weren't solid like the lines in a rifle barrel. And they were broken up, but they were formed by a series of small clouds that were hovering about 10 to 20 feet off the walls of the tunnel. So why I'd say it's the fabric of time that I was seeing is because it should have taken me 3 minutes to reach the other end of the tunnel.
At 220 miles an hour.
Yeah, but it only took 20 seconds. So time is coming into effect now. Space and time.
Right.
They're warping. And when I reached the other end of the tunnel, it had reduced its size to about 30 feet. Because the wingtips scraped the edges of it, and the wings were 36 feet. I looked back after we made it out, supposedly into clear air. The tunnel collapsed right behind the plane. That's how close it was in timing. It formed like a slit, and now the slit was rotating clockwise, because as I flew through the tunnel, it was rotating counterclockwise.
Right.
And this is the point where I had this sensation that I'll never forget, that I have experienced only once, and it's similar to zero gravity. I've experienced that many, many times, zero gravity. But this was like a combination of hydroplaning, skidding forward, and zero gravity at the same time. And it lasted about almost 10 seconds. And at the same time, the clear blue sky that we had just entered disappeared, and everything was this dull gray color, maybe a little bit of yellow in it. Visibility was nil. It was very strange because the sky actually appeared to be clear, no clouds or anything, and yet I couldn't see the horizon or the ocean. Didn't look right. I wasn't sure if it was the ocean or not. Yeah.
Are you guys still calm at this point? Because I'm telling you, there's about 4 or 5 times I've already would have tried to jump out of the plane, I think.
Yeah, they started to get real upset, my dad and our passenger. So I calmed them down. I told my dad to give me a position fix. He was our navigator.
And how old were you at this time?
I was 23.
Okay.
Dad was around 65, early 60s, and Chuck was in his 40s. So my dad was fumbling around with the instruments. I took a quick look at him, and for some reason I couldn't figure out our position. So I asked my dad, and he couldn't figure out our position, which was very unusual because he was really good at it. So then I take a better look at the instruments, and the magnetic compass, the wet whiskey compass, is slowly rotating counterclockwise. And I'm not making any turns. It's just rotating by itself, maybe 5 or 10 RPMs. And then the electronic navigational instruments were all malfunctioning. So we couldn't use our instrumentation to identify our position, but I knew we were probably about 90 miles east of Miami when we came out of the tunnel. So I contacted Miami Radio. I guess I must have told them I wasn't sure of our position. Now, I know I told them we were 90 miles southeast of Miami, but I think I probably said, but I'm not sure.
I was thinking, a lot of the topics we cover are really way out there, but even the most fantastical stories usually have a background in history or science, like tonight's topic deals with the science of extreme weather, which is a lecture series over at the Great Courses Plus.
If you're not in a weather-created space-time warp tunnel and your internet access and your whiskey compass are still working, you can learn wherever you go, which is how we love watching the Great Courses Plus.
That's right. And speaking of mobile learning, we're excited to tell you about a new way you can take advantage of a free 1-month trial of the Great Courses Plus and get unlimited access to over 8,000 video lectures on everything from extreme science to the Vikings, which are hot right now, to how to take better pictures.
Just text the word LEGENDS to 86329, and you'll receive a link to sign up so you can start watching immediately from your smartphone, tablet, or any device.
So Scott, tell everyone about the new course we're watching.
Absolutely. It's called the Black Death, the world's most devastating plague, taught by Professor Dorsey Armstrong. Remember, she's the one who taught us everything about the legend of King Arthur.
Of course, she's fantastic, a really engaging lecturer. I just followed her on Twitter.
You can do that?
Well, yeah, these courses are taught by real people who are real award-winning experts.
All right, smart guy. Tell us something about the event that killed off almost half the population of medieval Eurasia and changed the course of Western civilization.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing how devastating the Black Death was throughout the centuries. So many people were dying and so fast. It really was like the Monty Python Bring Out Your Dead sketch. Well, there are two major misconceptions about the Black Death, and one is that it was called that because parts of the bodies of the people that contracted it actually turned black. People always associate bubonic plague with the Black Death, but bubonic is just one strain of the plague that creates large lumps, or buboes, around the lymph nodes. So they assume Black Death refers to the color of those buboes, which is not the case.
Okay, you know what? I wonder... We should tweet this to Professor Armstrong, but I wonder if the term boo-boo, like when a baby hurts itself, comes from buboes. That's pretty fascinating if it's a case.
I would not doubt that.
Anyway, the other misconception was that the people of the time named it the Black Death, but no one in the Middle Ages actually called it that. They called it the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence. As Professor Armstrong said, it was a dark, black, terrifying time. Look, there's a good chance you're listening to us on your smartphone right now. So take a second to text the word LEGENDS to 86329.
To get the reply text, standard message and data rates apply. One last time, text LEGENDS to 86329 to receive this free month offer for the Great Courses Plus.
Hello, this is the Count of St. Germain, otherwise known as Kevin Pollak, and you're listening to Astonishing Legends with Scott Philbrook and Forrest Burgess. Keep listening.
All right, so he's really been through something here. It's pretty amazing.
Well, 3 people have that are confirming what he experienced.
And I love that they mentioned specifically what time they took off, that he actually looked at his watch and he wrote it down. He's very diligent in terms of his piloting skills and navigation.
I do know a few pilots, and they all do, and I believe it's a requirement to keep a log. Same thing with sailors, as you know.
Yes.
You keep a captain's log. As we saw with the Mary Celeste, they keep very detailed notes of everything that happens.
Yes.
So he noted on his watch, he left at 3 p.m. The other thing I like about this story is that it's a regular airport. They also have an idea of when planes take off and land.
That's right.
It is documented when he left and when he arrives in Miami.
Yes, and what's happening here that I think is important, and the reason that I wanted to break in here just real briefly is he's saying that he was pretty sure they were 90 miles east of Miami, which they should have been.
Right.
But they weren't, and that's when the problems began. And it's because whatever happened when they went through that tube, that's something that so far to date has still not been explained for him, to his satisfaction or anyone else's. And it really comes down to when he took off, how long he flew, the course changes he made, and how close he was to Miami when he emerged from that storm system.
Right. It's the same thing if you drove to Vegas from LA, let's say, for example. Even if you drive fast, it takes you about 3.5, 4 hours at a certain rate of time. And then you realize you get there in 2 hours. Like, well, I wasn't doing 200 miles an hour. That's impossible in my car. And yet you're in Vegas
2 hours later.
Right, exactly. An hour early. So that's what happened to Bruce and his passengers in the sky. They arrive, and that's why they're bewildered. It's like, well, where are we? The other great thing about this story is that the people who experience this perhaps and don't survive or get found again, that's why the story from Bruce is important with this phenomenon, because he is a trained observer, you could say. And I know people will say, like, well, why do we give more credence to pilots and military people? Because they do this. They're, again, unlike the average person who's not paying attention when they drive to Vegas too much, other than, sticking on I-15 and heading east. The deal is, as a pilot, you are trained to notice conditions, weather, time, distance, airspeed, knots, all that stuff. So he's paying attention. That's what we're saying. As he says, it's a very sober account.
And so he must have picked up there was something wrong. So he tried to identify us on his radar, and he couldn't find us on radar. He said he didn't have any airplanes at that time in between Miami and Andros Island. So that didn't help any. And so at that point, that's where my dad grabbed the microphone from me, and he started screaming at the guy. You mean you don't know our position? He says, we just got this brand new transponder installed. It's supposed to be able to identify us with it. That didn't help, you know. And so he starts yelling at the guy. I could see he was going into panic because you don't do that over the radio. You never swear.
Right.
So I grabbed the mic back from him and told the guy, everything's okay. We're just going to maintain our course and see what happens. I calmed my dad down. And then our passenger in the back, he starts telling me some things. He's slurring his words. I'm thinking, man, what the heck's going on here? He was getting nauseous, I guess. We were in what I call an electronic fog, and it has been known to make people pass out. So he was probably on the verge of doing that because he couldn't even make any sense with his words. So I remember saying to myself, okay, I'm going to have to just subtract him from my mind and make believe he's not even in the plane because he's just distracting me, and that didn't help any. And so I totally ignored him. So we kept flying, and we flew for 3 minutes after we exited the tunnel when another amazing thing happened. I call it an electronic dissipation of the electronic fog. These slits formed all around the airplane, parallel to the direction of flight. The slits appeared to be maybe a mile away or so. You know, I was like almost 2 miles high, and they appeared to be a few miles long. But I find out after much research that was an illusion. The slits were actually close to the airplane. And then what happened was, maybe 100 yards, and the slits slowly started opening up. And just before they opened up, wider and wider, the radar controller got on the microphone, and now he's yelling real loud. And he has an airplane directly over Miami Beach. And there had been radio silence for that whole 2.5 minutes or so. Even the commercial planes were kind of probably listening to see what was going to happen. And I told him, looked at my watch. I said, well, no, that's impossible. I'm still probably 80 miles east of Miami right now. And so then the slits opened up wider and wider until all the fog was gone and it was all blue sky. And it only took like about 10 seconds for that to happen. And at first it took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust from the dull gray to the bright blue. And I looked down below me and I'm directly over Miami Beach. I tell the controller, yeah, he's right, I'm over Miami. That's great, still at 10,000 feet. I said, all right, I'll go to Palm Beach. He says, you want me to stay with you? I said, no, I'll be fine, I'll make it to Palm Beach. And we're going to Palm Beach, which is north of us now, like 50 miles. Here's a huge storm over Fort Lauderdale and another huge storm over the Everglades. So I had to descend from 10,000 all the way down to only 500 feet to go in between the two storms, which formed like a bridge way out over the Everglades. And 30 miles, 40 miles out west over the Everglades, there was like a bridge connecting the two storms, which was a little less than 1,000 feet. That's why I had to go all the way down to 500 to fly in between the two storms and then head back northeast to Palm Beach International. So then we touched down around 3:47, and about a minute later, then I taxi up to the customs and check out the watches, and I look at it. Wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Now, the time was 3:48, and I had taken off at 3 o'clock, so I'd been flying. The trip only took 47 minutes of flight time, and I had probably traveled 250 miles instead of the 200, and I had made that flight, a dozen times before, and it always took an hour and 20 minutes. It took like 90 minutes. So somehow I got 30 minutes or so ahead of time, and I went through that tunnel. And the latest theory is from Professor Paris, who has worked with me on this. He's a scientist from the University of Nebraska. He thinks that when I came out of that tunnel, I wasn't 90 miles east of Miami. I was 10 miles east of Miami. And then it took the normal 3 minutes in the electronic fog while that was going on to reach Miami. So apparently these tunnels, I call them a time tunnel vortex. I'm not the only living person anyway that's flown through one, so I can still talk about it.
This is a basic calculation that I can't even do, but to go 250 miles in 47 minutes, what would have had to been your average speed?
I think it's over 300 miles an hour.
Right, which your aircraft is not even capable of.
No.
in Miami Control saw you and had you on radar. So you went from Andros at 3 p.m. to West Palm Beach on this zigzag path because when you got to Bimini, you had to turn south. Then you had to go through the tunnel to the west. You popped out over Miami and then had to fly. You were going north to Palm Beach, but you had to deviate way over the Everglades to get through the two storms that were there.
That's right. And then deviate back to the northeast to Palm Beach International.
All of that in 47 minutes.
That's right.
With one passenger who's talking word salad and about to pass out, your dad yelling at the controller yelling at you guys. It's an amazing story. It's just...
The passenger recovered as soon as the electronic fog dissipated.
That's good.
The big question on time is when I entered the tunnel. I mean, I'm 100 miles from Miami. How did I get to Miami in 3 minutes and 20 seconds?
Yeah, that's when you really would have had to...
Go over 2,000 miles an hour.
Right, which is what, Mach 4 or 5 or something?
The other question, if Professor Parrish is right, he says it just took me 20 seconds to fly through the tunnel and travel, it would be 90 miles.
The storm itself that caused all these deviations and all the work that you had to do to get through it, did you get the sense that that was sentient or it was just a natural occurrence that you were dealing with?
If it was natural, or what's the other thing?
Sentient, like it was trying to trap you.
I've been told that, but I've never got that sense, though.
It was just something happening that you were trying to escape.
It was like fate. Some kids I got through emailing me. The kids are really interested, fifth graders. Some of them ask really great questions. Others want me to do the report for them, so I usually don't. They asked me, was I thinking about a miracle when I flew through this time storm? I thought that was an interesting question.
That is an interesting question.
But looking back at it, it was like a miracle. And then they asked me, if I was scared, a little more intelligent than just scared. The answer to that was no, because at the time, I was only 23, and I actually it's a bad trait for a pilot. I felt like I was invulnerable. The expression "no fear" came out a couple of decades after that.
Yeah.
That's the way I was at that age. It's like I was really calm, cool, and collective when we went through the storm.
Sure.
But today it would be just the opposite.
Since then, in the intervening years that you flew well over 50 years, had you ever experienced anything else even remotely similar to this? And I'm sure you went back and forth several more times to the Bahamas. Did anything else even close ever happen?
Yes, well, I've been back many times by boat and plane. By boat lately, I've gone 3 times in the past 6 months. The experience in 1996 relates to the electronic fog that I had when I was living in the Florida Keys at an airport community. And I flew into an area where several other pilots have had an experience with the electronic fog. That's a whole other story that would take a while for me to tell you. It's in my book, The Fog. It was not as intense as the time storm I flew through. But apparently these storms, I used to study them when I lived in the Keys. I could see the edge of the Everglades from the bay. I had a house on the bay, and so I watched thunderstorms forming almost every afternoon. And a lot of times the two storms would form with the cells side by side, and then the anvil heads would connect, and they would form tunnels over this area of Florida. It's probably the stormiest area of all Florida. It's the southern tip of the Everglades. This would usually happen in the early evening. See, my theory is that when these tunnels form in between these powerful thunderstorms, I've seen many of them, too, studied them, photographed them. They usually last only 3 minutes, just like the one that I flew through. And what happens was, when they collapse, they form what I call electronic fog, and it's like a spear. Another good name for it would be a ball lightning cloud. Instead of just a small ball lightning, it'd be a big ball lightning, maybe 100 yards in diameter. And that spear of electronic fog can drift around for, just like other fogs, for many hours, maybe even half a day. Depending on the wind currents, it could drift upward to 80, 90,000 feet, or it could drift all the way down to the surface. So one morning in the Keys, I took off, and when I reached the tip of the Everglades, this electronic fog connected to us. And my wife was with me that time, and it wasn't strong enough to envelop the entire airplane, but it stayed underneath us. And I thought that this fog had just formed, because fog can form instantly. And I just happened to be over it. It's a little low on fuel. I mean, I had enough to make it to my destination, but once I saw this fog, I got worried that I may have to go someplace else to land. It looked like it went as far as I could see. And again, this is another illusion that this fog formed. The reason is because I never realized both times, in 1970 and 1996, that the fog was connected to the aircraft, kind of like St. Elmo's fire.
Okay, sure.
It took me 30 years of research to finally realize that. And that's why an illusion is formed when you're in it, because being trained as a pilot, you think you're flying through this fog. You don't realize you're flying with it. So your mind doesn't conceive properly, and then an illusion can form. So I'm thinking this fog goes on forever, and so I called the Miami radio again and got a hold of the weather department, and I told them about the fog, and I wanted to know, how extensive is it? I wasn't sure if I could make it to my airport, which was Palm Beach International, and he says, well, what fog are you talking about? And I said, the fog that's all around us. He said, there's no fog reported anywhere in Florida. And so that kind of helped me years later to realize that it was attached to me. And then another strange thing happened. It formed a hole in the fog directly underneath the aircraft. And I'm not the only pilot that has seen this. There's another famous pilot named Martin Caden, a great aviation author that experienced the fog that had the openings in it, just like the one I flew through, just like this one I flew over the second time. And so this tunnel underneath me was about the same diameter as the airplane. And so I looked through it, and I can see the Everglades below the airplane, and it looks like the Everglades is moving the same speed as the airplane. And I'm thinking, man, this is a strange event here. This hole in the fog must be somehow kind of like connected to the airplane, and it's moving with the airplane wherever it goes over the fog. But I didn't realize the fog was attached to me, so it wasn't cutting through the fog like I was thinking. It was just staying stationary with the fog. So anyway, at that point, I got a hunch to head for the ocean. I thought maybe I could get away from this fog. I was heading north. I made a right turn to the east and started heading for Biscayne Bay, south of Miami. As I got closer to the bay, the hole started getting wider. And so I started to feel some relief. And then when I reached the ocean, the hole was so wide that the only thing that was left was like a ring around the airplane. Again, here's another illusion that formed. I'm looking at this ring around the plane, and I'm thinking, what is that, 2 or 3 miles away from us, or 5 miles? And then another strange thing, whenever I'd look through the ring against the cloud as a background, or some of the earth, there would be a gap in what I was seeing. Kind of like when you look through a camera zoom lens or telescopic, where you have a split screen and then you get it to line up.
It's lensing, creating some kind of lens that's altering what you're seeing.
Similar to that, there would be a gap in the line. And I think this gap, again, has something to do with time. I think I was seeing the fabric of time. Even when I made it back to Palm Beach, and when I'm on final, down to 50 feet above the runway, I'm looking around, I could still see this ring around the airplane. I thought, strange. And then it disappeared as soon as we touched down. So then, like 4 years later, I finally figured out that it was attached to us. And it's something I try to warn pilots, but it's hard to get the word out in mainstream science. It's like if a pilot gets caught in this electronic fog and he's over the ocean, he should aim for a mainland, because that's where it attached to me the first time I got caught. And then apparently it's just the opposite. If you're over a mainland, like I was over the Everglades, head for a large body of water, and it should detach from you. So pilots maybe someday will learn that it's one of the maneuvers to make when they run into electronic fog.
Do you think that the fog creates itself under certain conditions, or do you think it's a byproduct of some other phenomenon, like the colliding storms?
Definitely a byproduct of the two storms running into each other, forming a horizontal tunnel with all this energy all around the tunnel. As the tunnel swirls, it creates like a time warp, something that can affect time.
The book made an indication that something similar to this may have been recreated in a laboratory setting. Do you know anything about that?
Well, there was this scientist, well known, and it became known as the Hutchison effect. And some people try to debunk him, saying, well, he never really created it. I talked to him back then, and he's not able to create it again. That's because he's kind of a different kind of scientist. I guess
Right.
drugs or something, and then he forgot how to do it. But he had pictures of it, and he thought for sure that it was electronic fog, the same thing that I experienced. It was like a silver mist that he created in the laboratory, and it did strange things, like go through a wall or something, or change materials into melt things, and strange stuff, which you don't hear from them anymore. But they still mention the Hutchison effect. So maybe it can be created in a laboratory someday.
What's his full name?
Professor David Paris, he teaches physics, and he's a meteorologist for like 40 years,
Okay.
Air Force meteorologist. I've got a new book coming out. It's going to be called Beyond the Bermuda Triangle. It'll be available in bookstores probably in August.
Oh, great.
The publisher's going to really do a major marketing production to try to promote it. So hopefully it'll do well, because I really think it's really important for people to find out mainly about electronic fog. I've had hundreds of people contact me that have experienced electronic fog. And so there's a lot of stories in the new book of people that have had experiences with this.
Even in your book from 2000 when you first published it, there's a mention of possible connection to Flight 19 and also some events that Charles Lindbergh experienced.
Yeah. So now I think there's a connection to that Malaysian flight that disappeared.
That's something I wanted to ask you about. Do you feel like there's something going on that might have connected to MH370?
Absolutely, just like I do with Flight 19. There's similarities. And with Lindbergh, too. When it attached to them, all their instruments started malfunctioning. And even their radio didn't work. The Malaysian flight, they tried to go higher, so did Lindbergh. I believe 19 did, too, to see if they get above it. It won't detach. And they don't know it's attached. And then they flew low, and they couldn't get under it. So, and this is almost unheard of for the Malaysian flight. They went above their legal altitude. At 777, I believe it's only allowed to cruise at just over 30,000 feet. And they went up to close to 45,000 feet. Not supposed to be going that high. And then they went down low. That didn't work. And the first turn they made was toward an airport that they would have been able to land at, which would make sense. Then they go through a series of turns. Now, Lindbergh, he didn't do that. He was so intelligent. He was able to figure out a way to escape it. But the others, they never figured it out. They went through a series of turns. Another thing I want pilots to understand, if they're caught in this electronic fog, only make one turn. And that depends where it's attached to you, and then either turn to the mainland or turn to the main body of water. Because once you make two turns, you're going to start to lose your sense of direction. And then if you make three, which they all made over 3 turns, now you got to start guessing which way is north and south. You have absolutely no idea anymore. You're going to lose track because none of your electronic instruments are going to work. And even your old-fashioned whiskey compass is not going to help you, even in a modern airplane. Because once all the electronics go out, you can't navigate.
Do you feel that when a plane gets caught in this, if it can't shake free of this, that it might crash like MH370, or that it might, similar to what happened to you, be slingshotted somewhere that it wasn't expecting, especially if it's back out to sea or something like that, and it's unrecoverable at that point because there's no way to get a bearing and you just run out of fuel and that's it?
That's what happened to Flight 19 in Malaysia. They just kept going to the rail. These guys are really great pilots, and they were able to maintain level flight. But what happens is, if you're not that sharp a pilot, you become spatially disoriented. It's like not your fault. I mean, you could be a pretty good pilot, but the fog induces this. You start to get a little dizzy because you're so upset that you can't figure out where to head. That what's called the graveyard spin, you can't pull out of once you get into it. You start winding down, straight down, spinning while you're doing that. And then if you try to pull out, it'll just make the turn even steeper because it won't pull out. You're going too fast now. That's happened to many, many pilots.
It's like a spiral, right?
Spiral.
Right.
The spatial disorientation, they lose their sense of turning. They get to the point where they're not sure if they're turning, flying level.
There's a story, and the specifics on it escape me right now, but I feel like I heard it on NPR at some point, but I can't remember. A story of a pilot who lost his way a little bit, and at some point he looked down and saw an airport, but the people that were working on the ground were out of time. They were from another time period. They were wearing uniforms from the future, yellow coveralls, where at the time they were wearing a different color. Have you ever heard that story?
That story is explained in detail in my new book.
Oh, it is. Wonderful. Wow, I'm excited about this book. So it's out in August?
It should be on the bookshelves in August. First book is really related just to the Bermuda Triangle, but this phenomenon happens all over the world. It's not just the Bermuda Triangle.
When your book comes out, if you're interested, we'd be happy to have you back on the show if you want to talk about that.
That'd be great.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I appreciate that, too.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. If you've been paying attention, you'll know that technology is profoundly changing the marketplace, and in turn, it's dramatically altering the labor force, too.
I agree. I think that trend's as obvious as it is inevitable. But before we're all totally ruled by our robot overlords, one thing will never change, and that is the success of any business depends on hiring the right people. That's just a fact.
And to find the perfect hires, you need to post on all the top job sites. So let the online technology of ZipRecruiter do that for you.
With a single click, ZipRecruiter.com can post your opening to over 200 plus job sites, as well as social media networks like Facebook and Twitter. Because no matter what your business is, you increase your chances of finding good people by broadening your search as much as possible.
And speaking of broadening your search, ZipRecruiter will search every city or industry for you nationwide. Just post once and watch your qualified candidates roll into ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use interface.
So once you've put out the call to the whole country for your staffing needs, whether it's a major corporation or your home-based business, how do you organize all your responses? Well, ZipRecruiter lets you quickly screen candidates, rate them in your dashboard, and hire the right person fast. So no more juggling phone calls to your personal line or buried emails.
Try it out and see why ZipRecruiter has been used by Fortune 100 companies and thousands of small and medium-sized businesses.
Because right now, Astonishing Legends listeners can post jobs on ZipRecruiter for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/legends.
That's ZipRecruiter.com/legends.
One more time, to try it for free, go to ZipRecruiter.com/legends.
I'm Kristen DeWitt, and this is Astonishing Legends, the best podcast around. Let's get back to the show.
Well, that was a really fascinating interview, and I've only talked to a few people personally or listened to that have a genuine time slip story. Maybe not as well documented as this either.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very sober experience. He was at a very sober point in his life when he was dealing with this. He was young. I just remember I was thinking about how I had kind of a fast car, not in college, but after college. And I still have that car because I enjoy it. But the difference between how I operate it now and how in touch I am with it in my environment and how I did when I was in my 20s is like night and day. And that's the thing I want our listeners to remember is that the point at which Bruce was in his life, as he said himself in the interview, he was feeling kind of invincible and he was writing everything down. And I'm sure he thought that nothing could happen in that plane that he couldn't deal with, which is what he said himself. I'm not casting aspersions on his character.
He also said it was kind of a dangerous attitude for a pilot because you shouldn't rely on your feeling of invincibility at 27.
By the way, I want to add, as somebody who used to ride, it's a dangerous attitude for motorcyclists as well. So if you're feeling that way, check yourself.
Imagine anything. Just, you in your 20s, you millennials, you can get hurt or disappear into a time slipstream. He not only is at the height of his senses, being a young man with 2010 vision.
Yeah, 2010.
Yeah, pretty good eagle eye there. But he's also got his father with him as navigator, a very seasoned, licensed pilot who knows what he's doing. And it's funny, the turnabout is, as you heard in the interview, that Bruce himself he'll figure it out. He'll get through this. He just needs to get his bearings. Dad, on the other hand, is starting to freak out a little because this should not be happening.
Yeah.
There's no reason for this in all of rationality. So that's why I think he's a little more animated and a little more flustered because he realizes, again, through experience, as we do as we've gotten older, like, you can get yourself into trouble, and they may be in some deep trouble right here.
Yeah,
and Mr. Lafayette is just queasy in the back.
Yeah, queasy and talking word salad there for a minute.
Yeah,
although he did pull himself together, I don't wish to paint him as
but this brings up an interesting question. As soon as the fog lifts or they clear it, he seems to immediately get better.
Yeah.
So is that just an effect on certain people? As some people don't do well on certain rides, they get nauseous or they get seasick or they're affected by all various forms of natural stimuli.
I can relate. I used to be a day sailor. I don't sail so much anymore, but I myself had seasickness problems. And in fact, one time famously, I was taking a trip with my dad from Marina del Rey to Catalina. and I had one of those patches on, the scopolamine.
Oh, did it work?
It worked great. It was working so good that I thought actually it wasn't doing anything and I just wasn't seasick, so I tore it off.
Oh, dear.
And in about 15 minutes, I was green in the gills.
Yeah, I think I may have had it once, and it's incapacitating, and it lasts for a long time. That's why I said that his comment was very unusual in that as soon as they got through it, he immediately got better. But you would think if he's prone to that, maybe it's the jostling. It's also kind of a violent, intense type of storm experience. And he's certainly flown a lot at this point. But,
and when being in a private plane is a unique experience as well. I've only done it once myself.
Yeah.
I had a friend who had a plane, a commercial director, and he let me fly it a little bit for a minute, which I don't know what possessed him to do that.
Yeah. Well, you notice that it's hard to keep level. I've done it myself a little bit.
I was okay with the wheel. It was the foot pedals that were screwing me up.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It takes a lot of practice to keep the thing level. So I have a lot of respect for pilots, but it's also, the trim wheel is where they kind of level it out.
Yeah.
But this is what's interesting in that he experienced this twice now in two different forms. One, very intense with light flashes. I guess you could call it lightning flashes, like almost like a St. Elmo's fire, some kind of electrical storm of sorts, and in a milder setting with his wife. So it happens. And he's not the only pilot in that area that this happens to, obviously.
Yeah, and I do want to touch on again, because I know it can be hard to follow, especially if you're not a, map pilot-y person. There's a lot going on here. I just wanted to touch again on some of the things about his trip that need to be understood. One is that he noted his exact liftoff time at 3 p.m.
Right.
He had a plan. His flight plan was to fly directly to Bimini, and then from there directly to Palm Beach International Airport.
Right.
And that's a total trip of about 210 miles. And generally, it takes about 90 minutes. He's made it dozens of times.
Right.
Prior to this, they've been going back and forth trying to figure out if they're going to build these resorts in the Bahamas, which, talk about ahead of your time, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
That was a good plan.
Yeah. No, they realize the area is very nice. And I think he said about once a month, they would go fly down there to check out the property. And I think they were trying to work a deal with the British government.
Right. And he knew this trip backwards and forwards. And as he said, this trip should have been 210 miles. It wound up being 250 miles because they had to take 4 deviations. And all of that's on his chart. And you can see the chart, which we've already mentioned. So I also think it's interesting that they went a good little ways, but within about 50 miles, they talked about turning back. They had enough concerns because when they saw the clouds in front of them and they were climbing, and then the clouds kept pushing them up higher and higher and higher. He's getting concerned about their altitude, the oxygen, and then the clouds keep swallowing the plane and then pushing them up and swallowing the plane. They're like a plaything in this system.
Well, they're being tossed around. It's like a second ocean. Like they were a boat, but in the sky. Giant waves are tossing them, except that these waves are clouds. And so as he's describing this, they're getting pushed higher and higher. And as he also mentioned, a lot of pilots will try and climb higher and higher, but you are limited by either the machine or FAA rules. You're really not supposed to do that, as he said.
Yeah, or your ability to breathe.
Or your ability to breathe, because at a certain point, you're going to need artificial oxygen, or you try and fly underneath it. I think he said it went all the way down to the water surface.
He said it had no ceiling.
Yeah.
The ceiling was on the floor, which is great when you're having a dance song, but it's not so good.
Dancing on the ceiling, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about. It was a horrible reference. But anyway, the point is, it went all the way down to the floor, so you couldn't fly under it.
Right.
Unless you wanted to crash into the ocean.
And here's the next dangerous thing. Some pilots get into trouble because they'll make a few turns.
Yes.
And he says, his advice, again, make one turn. That way, now you don't lose track because you can get easily turned around.
Yeah, when you start making 2 turns, if your compass is spinning, and I love this term, and this was new to me because I'm not a pilot, but the whiskey compass, or the wet whiskey compass, which I guess they call it the whiskey compass because the dial is in alcohol. And I had to look that up. But so if I'm wrong, I only found one website that told me the answer to that.
Well, if you're shipwrecked and you need a drink, you know where to find it.
Yeah, in your whiskey compass.
In your whiskey compass.
But you got to save that for the life raft.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different
make out of
things,
the coconut trees.
Or your freckle cream.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, with your one shoe.
Yeah.
So here's what's documented. He makes a note that he takes off at 3 p.m. from the Bahamas. At 3:47, he makes contact and lands at Palm Beach International.
That's correct.
47 minutes later, this trip should have taken 90. And so they know when he makes contact, his father gets PBI on the radio, the air traffic control.
Yes.
Out of Palm Beach. That's documented. So either he was able to travel over 300 miles an hour in a plane that's only top speed is about 220, redlining it.
That's right.
Something happened here.
Something
Again,
did happen. And another thing to understand, if you're not looking at the chart, and eventually I hope that you do get a chance to look at it, is that the storm, it's kind of like a hurricane in that it's shaped like a donut, and it has what seems like an eye in the middle, which is when he first described, he kind of thought he was in the clear, but then he realized on the horizon there was the other side of the storm. He was completely surrounded by this storm that is going all the way down to the water and up to unbelievable heights, too high for him to even fly over.
Yeah.
And so now he's noticing that it's not a complete ring. In some ways, you would think of it, it's funny, I think about the ship in Alien and also in Prometheus.
Right.
That's sort of a U shape or horseshoe shape.
Yes.
But there's an opening at the end, and
Right.
he's inside of that ring, and he's like, I've got to get out this opening. But as he's going towards it, like every great science fiction movie, it's closing up.
Yeah, it's like in Independence Day, you're trying to get the UFO out of the mothership, and of course the doors are closing.
They're closing. There's
you
an
gotta tilt
aperture.
it. Yeah, you always got to tilt it. It's like the Millennium Falcon. You got to tilt it on its side, squeeze out like a coin in a slot machine.
Well, and that's what happened to him. You know, he headed for this tunnel, and the tunnel was closing down. And for him, the tunnel appeared to be 10 miles long.
Right.
And he's got a pretty good record of judging distance. Of course, on the other hand, he did say that later the slits that appeared next to the plane that he thought were several miles long, actually, that was an optical illusion. They were much closer to the plane.
Ribbons of cloud, he could say, like ribs of some sort. When you read up on these kind of incidents, especially with airplanes and time slip stories, that storm is often described in the same way, little variations. But as he mentioned, or I guess as you guys mentioned, the story of Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard of the British Royal Air Force. And that was when he flew through the storm and had a very similar experience, at least with a storm, in a plane. So this happened in 1935, as I said, and he was on his way from Edinburgh, Scotland, to his home base in Andover, England. And he decided he was going to fly over the airfield at Drem, not far from Edinburgh. So as he's doing this, he encounters a storm. And this is where I saw the similarities. It's kind of a violent storm, strange-looking clouds that are kind of brown and yellow, and that also the yellow coloration reminded me of Bruce's description, along with the matte gray and the weird matte gray sky, which should have been blue. So he gets through that, but his plane starts spiraling down. He almost crashes. He manages to pull out, and then he's in the eye of the storm. Like a lot of hurricanes, you get into a center spiral vortex of some sort, the middle of the jelly donut, and he looks up and it's bright blue, beautiful sky. And that's when he looks down and he sees the airfield, but it's different because suddenly now it's in working condition, where in his day, in 1935, it's derelict. But there are 4 airplanes on the ground. 3 of them are yellow. One's a monoplane, meaning the single wing,
Which hadn't been invented yet.
which they did not have at that time. Now they would 4 years later, along with the mechanics in the blue jumpsuits, which at his time in 1935 were brown. So he wasn't quite sure what he was seeing. Here's 4 airplanes that are now painted yellow that seem familiar. He recognizes those because those are biplanes, except one monoplane. So that's pretty strange. And the other thing is that he's flying low enough that these mechanics should look up, as everyone does. This is close to wartime here. At least they got through World War I. None of them looked up. He said, well, that's strange. They're not noticing me. It's pretty loud and noisy. So that was odd. And then he goes through the other...
Reminds me of a quote from I Hate to Pull Young Guns Out, and I'm not going to use all the words in this quote, but it's like, how come they ain't shooting at us? We're in the spirit world. They can't see us.
That's right. Well, that's, the ships and the local indigenous peoples not seeing the ships. That's that whole story. Like, well, they're busy, working at the beach. They didn't have time to look up in ships.
Right.
Foreign ships. I would say, like, look, that's the law of boating and planes. You wave. Everybody waves. You just do that. You notice it. So anyway, he flies through the outer edge of the storm, gets back. He's back on track again. So, and then he didn't realize later, until 4 years later, in 1939, that what he'd seen may have been the future.
It came to pass. All right. Well, you know what's interesting to me about this, and this only just now occurring to me. I wish I had asked Bruce about it to see if it's something that he had thought about before. But in the case of that particular storm, which is very similar,
yes,
there's a couple of things about the commonality between what Sir Victor Goddard experienced and what Bruce may have experienced. Imagine this. It could be possible that Bruce and his passengers in the eye of the storm had slipped time as well, but they would have no way to know that being over the ocean.
Exactly.
There would be no frame of reference. So that could be an added side effect of the phenomenon that he never would have discovered or realized because they were just flying over water.
Right. There's no visual reference. It's all kind of the same. except that he notices that these clouds are moving much faster than clouds usually do. That's why it was hard to gauge, but he said like the rate of gasoline in a puddle igniting, or a ring of gasoline racing down that line, igniting itself. But that's what's strange to me, is that if this is a regular storm, you usually don't get chased by clouds.
Yeah. Well,
but as he said, it's also an illusion because they're moving with you.
Well, and here's the other question. I wonder with the Sir Victor Goddard story, and we want to do an episode. We always talk about episodes later, and people are actually started drinking games about that. But I would love to do one more specifically about time slips, which I think was probably what Bruce's next book is about, what he was alluding to, but being nonspecific.
Right.
Might be more about time slips. And we're not talking about clocking in at work.
and the time cards. No, what's interesting is that I've heard plenty of stories from people that have experienced them on the ground. And it doesn't require a storm. Sometimes it's just a strange being in a weird location. One of my favorite Jim Harold campfire stories is a couple going in to see a movie, Hellboy. They go and they sit down.
Great flick.
Yeah, they go to sit down. They go, well, that was weird. Why are we seeing the end credits? They'd lost like an hour and a half. And it just freaked them out. They came out. The guy said, hey, do you remember us? I said, yeah, I tore your ticket. You came in here and you sat down an hour ago. It's like, we missed the whole movie. He's like, I don't know what to tell you there. But this happens. And I have a friend we may have mentioned before who has his own time slip experience driving somewhere. But they're hearing the elements of his story. That may be a totally or different thing.
Well, I mean, these that involve the storms, and this is the question I have about the Sir Victor Goddard story, is about whether or not when he came through the other side, if he had experienced a geographic time-space bump like Bruce did.
You mean shooting forward?
Yeah. And he might have and just not documented it or not have recognized it.
He may not have.
It was a more primitive time
right.
and flying. And he may have been so discombobulated by nearly crashing and seeing that stuff that he might have completely disregarded the fact that he advanced in both time and space when he came through the other side of the storm as well.
Right, because there's a lot of variables here that are interesting to think about. If you do like to think about time and space slips, the time-space continuum here, because I asked this to Scott earlier. It's like if your perception of time just stops, say like the world clock, just somebody puts it on pause, and you're still traveling at the same distance. Well, you have the experience of like, that was an hour, but you look at your watch like, well, no, I just saved 40 minutes. I don't understand. However, their distance and time were both shortened. So you may think this is crazy and he didn't know what he was talking about, or he's making this up so he can write a book. A lot of people say that and accuse people of that. In space, and I realize that this is on cosmic levels, but in a black hole, the same thing happens. A tremendous cosmic-sized anomaly happens in that a star collapses. A giant star sucked down to the size of a basketball, sucking in light, other suns, stars, planets, everything in its path. It's insatiable, but it's also sucking in time and gravity, I believe. So this is not impossible. It just doesn't happen here on Earth very much, but maybe it could.
We always talk about movies probably too much, but a good example of how that all works is Interstellar, if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, no,
it's an interesting look at how time shifts when you add a black hole into the mix.
Right, because it's standard Einstein's theory of relativity. You traveling away from something, time slows down, essentially, very basically. And so people on Earth, they've aged 100 years, and you're still 35 and looking like Matthew McConaughey, all spring and chipper and handsome. So that is...
All right.
All right, I'm still 40. So that's one principle that happens. But what I was going to say, when we look at anvil clouds...
Yeah.
This is a very natural phenomenon. I've never seen really a lenticular cloud. I've seen kind of rolling bank clouds. So if you look this up, we'll certainly have photos of it, but go look that up on Wikipedia.
I've seen them. Absolutely.
Yeah, very
in
unusual.
North Carolina.
So what he's saying is it's a confluence, I work that word in as much as I can, of several weather factors going on. So you have a lenticular or a strange cloud pattern, a storm, which is it's a very stormy area happening. And then at the end of this, like you said, the open horseshoe, you have these two massive anvil stacked clouds coming together. And maybe that is enough, that mix there. It's not as powerful as a black hole. Certainly light is not escaping. But maybe it's just powerful enough, and there's enough electromagnetic disturbance that it is kind of screwing with time, and maybe at least the distance part of it can be explained by interdimensionality.
Just to clarify again, I do want to come back before we move on a little bit to some of the math associated with Bruce's trip. He went 250 miles in 47 minutes. In order to accomplish that, we've said this, he said this, and we probably said it a minute ago, but I just want to restate this. He would have had to do an average of 319 miles per hour in a plane whose top speed is 220.
Yeah, remember, he's redlining that thing. That engine is stressed to the maximum.
Right, and that piece of information is regardless of the idea of what his position was when he came through the other side of the storm. Professor Paris seems to think that he was about 10 miles from Miami. Whether that's right or wrong, he still went about 250 miles in 47 minutes. Now, Paris also suggested that he essentially went, as he passed through the ring of the storm, the donut, as it were, as it was closing up, he went in 3 minutes and 20 seconds, he went 90 miles. That's what propelled him closer to the coast of Miami. That is over 2,000 miles per hour,
right.
or Mach 2.3. Again, outside the operating envelope of a Beechcraft Bonanza A36.
Yes, probably capable of, well, Mach 2.3, I think a jet fighter can do that.
Yes, it can. The Blackbird was 4.5 I think, or 4.
Yeah, that's
like
at the
that.
very,
And
of
that's
known,
the published number.
of known Black Ops aircraft,
Yeah.
Skunk Works type vehicles. Imagine the things that we don't know about, maybe like the Aurora project.
Yeah.
But again, this is a plane that operates not on jets, it's a prop plane.
Yes.
So it has its limits. Now, some people might say, well, if the compass was affected, why not the engine compartment? I think Dr. Paris's view was that engine compartment was shielded.
Yes.
So, of course, yes, it requires a spark. It's a combustion engine and electricity, I guess, in a way, with the capacitors, the spark plugs. So a lot of UFO stories, the car gets conked out and then immediately starts back up as soon as the
the
lights
starting
off
back
again.
up part. We encountered what was the story with the fog that enveloped the car and it turned off? That was Linda Godfrey. Was
yes, that's
from her
correct.
book.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
about the fog came up and then the car stopped operating.
Yeah. Now, the ARC's very own Marie Mayhew was making some comments as this theme was being discussed today that possibly this fog was sentient and that it was chasing Bruce's plane.
Right, and you remember I asked Bruce about that. He didn't have the sense that it was, but
No.
the way that it was closing in on the plane, it is interesting. It did seem like it was trying to trap it,
Right.
But that can happen, I know, because I've lived through tornadoes and hurricanes, and
It seems
you
like
can
being
feel like
chased.
it's after you. You can definitely feel that
You're
way.
destroying everything in its path.
How could it be turning the same way my car is? You know,
Exactly. No,
it
exactly.
happens.
People, storm chasers will experience that. You turn the car and then you realize that we're now going to have to exceed the maximum speed of the car on a smooth road in a driving rain to get away from this thing.
Yeah.
But I think what she was getting at least the thought that came to me, is that, well, it's a little like with Linda Godfrey and the famous trail cam incident here, where they tried to get something with a digital camera triggered by a motion detector.
That's right. And they put bait out. They put I think it was a dead deer.
Yeah,
out
well,
to
different.
see what
Yeah, I
was
think several
happening.
different times and several different types of animals, and it was always taken in an instant. But all I could see is maybe out of the corner of the frame a fog,
A fog
a
moved in.
mist. But no movement, no animal, nothing. And it happened so much, I think
And they would find the carcass like 100 yards away
Yeah,
the next
so-
day, or
right.
what was left of it.
Right, so something carried it off. And again, some kind of strange mist. So maybe that's what she's talking about as far as it being
A carnivorous sentient fog.
some kind of that has intelligent motion, at least, that it's trying to chase you away or snatch you up into another dimension.
Well, you know what's interesting about this to me too, and you and I, we've both made no bones about our age. For us, when we were kids, the Bermuda Triangle was a lot bigger deal than it is now. It was really part of the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Haven't been able to say that in a few episodes.
I'm glad you got to work it in. But you were absolutely right, my friend, because as we said before, as we mentioned with Madame Blavatsky and the spiritualism movement and revival of the mid-19th century into about the 20s and 30s, that was a big time for occultism and spiritualism and seances and Ouija boards and all that kind of stuff, and it had a resurgence. Well, then you had the sobering effect of World War I and World War II happening, and then you had the common sense of the 50s, like let's pull up our bootstraps and get this country back together and get the world in shape again. And then you experienced the crazy spirituality again of the 60s and the mind expansion and the hippie movement. And people
This, by the way,
you know,
just to be fair, predates both of us. I'm really like,
Yeah.
we're this old and we remember the Bermuda Triangle. And then you're like, in caveman times.
when I was a boy and we were, pushing a rock around. The idea was I was born in mid-60s there, so a little young, but very ripe for the 70s. You know, very aware of stuff. So what I'm getting at is that you've gone through all the wacky, crazy stuff of the 60s, And then by the 70s, it shifted. So now it was still kind of the age of Aquarius, and but you had a lot of monumental books come out. Hal Lindsey's books about religion and prophecy and end times and all kind of that stuff. You had great shows coming out, the late 70s, In Search Of.
In Search Of, baby.
Sci-fi was, yes, popular in the 50s, but it was kids' stuff then.
I love that I have the In Search Of box set, and it's on DVD, and now DVDs are almost dead.
At least you have it on record. But that'll regain popularity here.
Yeah.
But what Scott is getting at, the 70s were kind of a revival again of Bigfoot, UFOs, Sasquatch. Times were changing again.
Yeah, when Close
people's
Encounters
attitudes.
was coming out.
Exactly.
And then the other thing that was happening was Charles Berlitz, who was just one of the most fun authors to read.
Well, the travel book writer, that's what everybody knows him as, usually.
Yeah.
The language and I think some travel books. But,
yeah. He wrote a book on the Bermuda Triangle that was a bestseller. That came out in 1974, and that probably really influenced culture at large, especially in the United States, with regard to how it perceived the Bermuda Triangle. And the Bermuda Triangle is, to be frank, where this story takes place.
Right.
And I think that it's important to note, another one of my favorite little expressions.
Yeah.
It's important to note.
Yes.
Everything I say is so important. But it's important to note that Bruce's experience took place 4 years before that book came out. It
Right.
took place, it was a precursor. In a way, it would be more the kind of event that would stir people to write things about the Bermuda Triangle. Now, this is something I did some research today on the Bermuda Triangle. This is not a Bermuda Triangle episode, but it does take place there. And one of the things I found that was interesting is a lot of people have talked about how statistically the disappearances in the Triangle are consistent with disappearances at large over all the world's oceans.
Right.
You know, barring Somali pirates in that area. There's probably an uptick over there. But
right.
My point is just that the best place to look for this is Lloyd's of London, who is the largest insurer of maritime operations.
Right.
And it turns out that in the Bermuda Triangle, their rates are consistent with the rest of the world. They do not go up. And believe me, if more events were happening there, disappearances and that sort of thing, then the rates would be higher.
We've been criticized for this as well in the past, I think with the Queen Mary, it's saying that it's a corporate entity recognizing that there's something paranormal or strange happening.
Well, no,
and
that
adjusting.
And the Queen Mary does that.
Look, it's all about money.
There's a room they won't take you in on the tour.
Yeah, and it's not so much that they think it's, but of course, they're pumping it up a little and marketing that because that sells tours of the room. But on the other hand, again, at the end of the day, it's about money. So if they're losing a bunch of cargo ships in the area, of course they're going to charge more money.
Right.
It's costing them out of pocket. That's not why they're in business, to explore strange phenomena. It's about to generate more money as an insurance company. So that's interesting, though, that they don't raise their rates for traveling.
The rates don't go up there, but this was my observation after
Right.
coming across that information. I mean, I had sort of always heard, or not always heard, but for several years now, that statistically there was no difference in disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Or the rest of the world's oceans. But the first thought that I had, of course, being co-host of Astonishing Legends is, that means the problem is everywhere. It's not that it's worse there.
Yeah, right.
You can disappear anywhere. And if you look at the missing 411, and I'm hoping that we'll get to interview David Paulides this year.
Yeah, that's
we got to reach out to him. And also the kinds of things that can happen at sea. And like I said, I used to be a day sailor. I have friends that were more major league sailors. But just being a day sailor, the stuff you have to learn just to charter a boat for a day will put the fear of God in you. About all the things that can go wrong in the ocean, explained and unexplained. There's plenty of unexplained disappearances. There's rogue waves, which we talked about in the Queen Mary episode. There's all kinds of things that can happen. And it's reasonable to believe there's all kinds of things that we don't understand, which is sort of what Bruce was saying about this storm.
It's not so crazy. I mean, this happens, the spinning compass. Sailors and pilots and people who put their lives at risk at traveling into space, what gives them comfort and courage is the consistency of it. You can read the stars. Those don't change. You can read your compass. There's always magnetic north. The brand new transponder you bought should be communicating your position. And when those things don't work, it's very disturbing. As Bruce said, it's like, it's time to calm him down and get the mic out of his mouth because you don't swear over
you
the
get in
air.
big trouble with the FAA.
And if you've ever heard your
HE double hockey stick
that's right.
no good.
Even when, military pilots, when they're under fire, keep it cool if you hear their, aircom chatter. So this consistency, these things being readable and being able to count on them, it's not such a leap in belief to think that in certain parts of this Earth, where this Earth is a giant magnet and there's molten metal churning at the core of it, and creating magnetic waves. And we're being bombarded by solar winds from outer space, causing the aurora borealis. These things are affecting us. And why isn't there a slight anomaly here and there? It makes total sense to me. And maybe it happens more in some places than others, but it's a very uncommon occurrence. As Bruce said, it's happened to him twice in his life now.
And here's the other interesting thing about this. What Goddard saw when he was in the eye of that storm and he looked down and it seemed like he was looking forward in time, that in itself is already an issue.
Right.
When it comes to time travel and all the theories about it, everyone seems to think you can go back or look back, but you can't look forward. So what does that say? That's a fascinating story.
Sure.
But here's the other thing, the fact that he wasn't acknowledged in that situation. It's why wasn't he acknowledged? When this comes to the whole thing about I think you and I have discussed it before in terms of ghost theory, stone tapes, the stone tape theory, which I think even Radiolab might have done a story on. I can't remember, but just about how information it echoes and is absorbed by the environment and can recur. And I don't want to get down the whole stone tape thing
but basically it's not as spooky as you think. Some ghosts are not ghosts; they're echoes. They're visual echoes of people and other times,
like in the Queen Mary story.
Exactly. What it is the leftover of human energy in a certain pattern. And
which is why it seems to swell up at crossroads like we talked about in the Mothman, and at freeways and intersections and places of travel, taverns on long-traveled byways where there's this huge concentration of energy, hotels, all these people are coming, going, bars. There's a pattern here, people. It's like the Queen Mary's a double whammy. It was a ship and a hotel. Yeah. It's like everything
and saw a lot of tremendous human emotion, and that's one recurring thing that I have noticed is that they often say places like churches, hospitals, things that have seen a lot of joy and a lot of pain, theaters where people just act out a lot of human emotion. A lot of them are haunted or people will see strange spirits, but again, it may not be ghosts roaming the halls or the catwalks. So it's not just one reason. Like I said, it's not just the Bermuda Triangle being a alien hotspot where they're getting beamed to a mothership, although that's kind of fun because in Close Encounters, they all come back except all the people you loved are dead now.
Yeah.
Maybe it's something that's just very natural, a weather phenomenon. Again, when you have two massive storms colliding in a ring and meeting at the end, it creates a tunnel. Not often, very rarely, but rare things happen in nature. And so maybe this isn't so woo-woo and out there in that it's just a phenomenon that happens, but a lot of times planes go missing because simply the pilots or the sea captains get disoriented.
That's right. And that's something very important to say. And I do want to talk about some other similar cases. The Ark dug up some very fascinating similar cases. One about a ship called the Mohican. Marie found a really cool article about that I actually want to read to you guys. And we want to talk a little bit about the Lindbergh story that Bruce mentioned as well. But the other thing that's interesting about what you just said, and that's interesting to me, is that if a plane gets enveloped in a fog like this that attaches itself to the plane or is so pervasive and thick that the plane can't get out of it and becomes disoriented and all the navigation gear is malfunctioning and the whiskey compass is spinning and you take more than one turn and you get disoriented, and if that turn you took or the series of turns you took, if you made that mistake, isn't towards a place where you can land before you run out of fuel, not only are you going to die, they're going to have no idea where to look for you.
Exactly.
And if you don't come out of the fog, it may not matter where they look for you because you might be in another dimension. But let's say you do come out of it like he did, and instead of being pointed at Florida, like he was lucky enough to be pointed directly at Florida, you're pointed out to sea. And even if you realize that you can get back, you're so far out, you can't get back. And that brings us to what possibly happened to Flight 19, which I'm going to take this opportunity to let our listeners know is going to be our very next episode.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
So,
I guess we have to do it now.
And by the way, just quickly, for the listeners who are still with us in the middle of the show, our new website has a calendar on it. And it's not like the most filled out calendar in the world, but it does project out a few weeks. So it will tell you when we have a dark week, and it will tell you of a pending topic if we have it figured out. We're definitely showing our cards here because we don't always figure the topic out that far ahead of time, which we like. That's the way we are. The topics choose us. But if you're wondering, oh, why didn't it come out this Friday?
Yeah.
Because we generally are 3 weeks on and 1 week off.
Yeah.
Year round, because it's
keep
too
our
hard to
sanity.
do it's too hard to do it
Right.
more than that with all the
Yeah.
research and everything. There are variations in that to allow for the holidays at the end of the year, or my son's spring break, or, God forbid one of us gets really ill. There will be changes, but for the most part, you will hear us 3 weeks in a row, and then we'll have one dark week.
Yeah.
So, and also I want to encourage everyone, there's a thing blowing up on Twitter right now. It's a hashtag, and it's not just Twitter, but Twitter's a really good place for it, called Tripod, and it's TRYPOD. And it's something that you can use to recommend your favorite shows to other people who haven't listened to podcasts yet, because there's still an opportunity for people who are podcasters to get their shows out to a larger audience, including us. So if you're on Twitter or Instagram or anywhere else that you can do a hashtag and you have a favorite show, Astonishing Legends, that you want to put out for Tripod, put it out there. It helps shows like us get larger, and it helps new and independent shows find audiences. And in the future, it's going to be a lot harder for those indie shows to get going, because large networks and companies are moving into the space. So the little guys need all the help they can get.
Yes, the behind the great paywalls. But no, I just got that tripod. I get it. Not like the camera tripod, but try a podcast. Or
Yeah, of course.
Well, very good. Thank you for that update. That was spectacular.
Tangent number 4022. So
Right.
let's roll it back here a little bit. Let's bring it back.
So here's a question to you before I forget to ask it. Is the cloud formation a natural thing that forms from the storm, or is the force that's creating this time slip causing the clouds? You know what I'm saying?
I'm gonna lean in for my answer to this. Are you ready?
Dear. Okay. Well, here's a visual. It's like pouring cold milk or cream into your hot coffee, and you'll see the thermodynamic process where it's roiling the clouds. So is something else causing this time slip, like an interdimensional slip, which I believe sometimes happens on terrestrial ground, and that because there's no storm.
It happens in Utah.
Yeah. Skinwalker
I'll tell you
Ranch.
that for nothing.
Yeah, there's tunnels that open up apparently, but there's no storm involved. It doesn't seem to be electromagnetic.
No, just angry orbs.
Angry orbs and guys wanting to take a little tourist visit into, I guess, the desert of Utah. Maybe that's a different cause or not at all. Who knows? But here, this could be, again, a weather phenomenon that's causing it.
Well, I think that's what Bruce thinks. I don't know.
Yeah.
The truth is, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know why you're asking me, because I don't know.
I just thought, what's your opinion? Because the clouds to me are they're moving very fast and very strangely.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not a meteorologist, so I don't know how fast really clouds can move, or what are the extremes in the upper atmosphere like that.
It's like a tsunami can move at sea at least several hundred miles an hour.
Sure.
You would certainly define that as strange if the only surf you'd ever seen was at the beach and you were fishing.
Sure.
So I think it is possible for a natural phenomenon to produce something like that would appear to be strange. I do think that it is possible that the electrical energy generated by a large storm system like that, especially in an environment that's conducive to producing these particular types of storms, which is what Bruce thinks. And another thing that he had mentioned to me in his emails is, I don't know if now, but at one point he was living in the Keys, and his house pointed at the Everglades. It looked north, and he saw them forming regularly.
Right.
Over the southern tip of the Everglades, which he thinks is a hotspot for these. It reminds me of that area, and I can't remember where it is now, some lake. I remember seeing pictures on Reddit about it, where it's the most lightning of anywhere on Earth.
Yeah.
And there's people that live there, and it's just every night there's a thunderstorm with like 10 million lightning strikes. Things happen. There's environments where strange things happen.
Yes.
Do I believe this could be a side effect of a natural phenomenon, as Bruce seems to believe? I do. Do I think it's Sentient Fog, which is also the name of Marie's new band from the Ark?
Was Sentient Whiskey Fog.
Sentient Whiskey Fog. Sentient Whiskey Carnivorous Fog.
There you go.
I don't necessarily think this is a sentient phenomenon or a manipulated phenomenon, unlike you would say if you believe in crop circles. There's clearly a work of intelligence there.
Seems to be, sure.
And it's not like Arrival. Don't know if anybody saw that, but the way that those creatures communicated in Arrival is very fascinating. But you would recognize if you saw that, even if it didn't make sense to you, that something intelligent was happening.
Yes.
And I don't think that's necessarily what was happening here. I don't think it was out to get Bruce or out to force him to experience something or necessarily out to trap his plane. But I do believe that something happened.
Much like the final countdown, swallowing the aircraft carrier.
Yes.
Captained by Kirk Douglas.
Yes.
No, that's another phenomenon that happened. That's kind of, and again, for the time, great visual effects, which is just basically the laser tunnel with the smoke. But it looks kind of cool.
Yeah.
And that one was described as a giant ship, an aircraft carrier, going through some kind of time storm, which is getting back to what Bruce was saying, how he described it. It's a storm of another element, of another force of the universe.
Well, speaking of time, I want to go back in time right now and talk about a couple of other incidents that Marie dug up that were maritime incidents and not aviation,
Right.
and in the same area. Okay, so in a minute, we're going to talk a little bit about the Charles Lindbergh incident, which Bruce mentions in the book, which I think is really fascinating and worth telling because, as you said, talk about a trained observer. He's one of the top aviators of all time.
All aviators have a lot of respect for what he did.
Yes.
And when he did it, which is amazing.
Yes, but before we get to that, I want to specifically read an article that Marie from the ARC dug up from the Washington Times. This is dated August 2nd, 1904.
Oh.
There's going to be a lot of things here that are going to sound kind of familiar to everybody. The title of the article is Ship Clad in Vapor Frightens the Crew. Strange experience of sailors on the steamer Mohican near the Delaware breakwater, compass disabled. So check this story out.
Uh-huh.
Philadelphia, PA. By the way, the Delaware breakwater is up where the Delaware River flows into the ocean. It's pretty far north of the area we're talking about, but listen to the scenario.
Was that anywhere near where the dead water incident happened?
I can't remember where the dead water incident was.
Quickly, that's just a ship seeming to not move.
No
in
wind,
the water.
no current,
Yeah,
nothing. Yeah.
Stationary.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a little part of this distance collapsing here.
Well, here we go. When the British steamer Mohican, Captain Urquhart from Ibralia, Romania, in this port, was making for the Delaware breakwater, it had a most remarkable experience, which terrorized the crew, played havoc with the ship's compass, and brought the vessel to a standstill for nearly half an hour. For that length of time, the Mohican was enshrouded in a strange metallic vapor, which glowed like phosphorus. The entire vessel looked as if it were on fire, and the sailors flitted about the deck like glowing phantoms. The cloud has a strange magnetic effect on the vessel, for the needle of the compass revolved with the speed of an electric motor, and the sailors were unable to raise pieces of steel from the magnetized decks. It was shortly after the sun had gone, Captain Urquhart said. The sea was almost as level as a parlor carpet, and scarcely a breeze ruffled the water. It was slowly growing dark when the lookout saw a strange gray cloud in the southeast. At first it appeared as a speck out on the horizon, but it rapidly came nearer and was soon as large as a balloon. Now, that to me is very familiar to what Bruce talked about, about this kind of balloon.
Right, like you said, a balloon drifting.
Yeah, that it could go. It made me think of a hot air balloon and how the environment takes it where it needs to go, and it could last for hours and hours. And it's very interesting.
You just happen to, unfortunately, be in the path of it.
Exactly. It had a peculiar gray tinge, and as it bore down upon us, we saw bright glowing spots on its mass. Suddenly, the cloud enveloped the ship, and the Mohican blazed forth like a ship on fire. And from stem to stern and topmast to keel, everything was tinged with the strange glow. The seamen were in terror. Their hair stood straight on end, not from the fright so much as from the magnetic power of the cloud. They rushed about the deck in consternation, and the more they rushed about, the more excited they became. I tried to calm them, but the situation was beyond me. I looked at the needle, and it was flying around like an electric fan. I ordered several of the crew to move some iron chains that were lying on the deck, thinking it would distract their attention. But the sailors could not budge the chains, although they did not weigh more than 75 pounds each. Everything was magnetized, and chains, bolts, spikes, and bars were as tight on the deck as if they had been riveted there. For half an hour, we were enveloped in that mysterious vapor, and for nearly all that time, after the sailors' first cries of fright had subsided, there was a great silence over everything that only added to the terror. I tried to talk, but the words refused to leave my lips. The density of the cloud was so great that it would not carry sound. Suddenly, the cloud began to lift. The phosphorescent glow of the ship and the crew began to fade. It gradually died away, and in a few minutes, the cloud had passed over the vessel, and we saw it moving off over the sea.
Wow, that's a great story.
It's pretty amazing, and Marie made a super valid point here. There was no financial gain for sharing this story.
Right.
Nothing was lost. There's no cover-up. They didn't try to hide theft of cargo.
Yeah.
None of that. This is just something that happened to them, and they all agreed that it happened, and they all agreed that it happened this way.
What year was this?
1904.
It's like with a lot of pilots. They don't report strange phenomena like UFOs. And same thing with ship captains. They're very serious, sober people. Again, back to Close Encounters. Like, do you wish to report a UFO? No.
Yeah.
Because then you're seen,
negative.
You're seen as a wacko.
Negative tower. We don't want to report that.
Yeah. You don't want that on record because then people were thinking you've had too many at the
And you're
airport bar.
retired.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. This story, though, of course, it reminds me a lot of like an old Star Trek episode where they're enveloped in this fog. Of course, then the fog would be sentient and some kind of form of
Oh, you're talking about the
extraterrestrial.
companion, which was on the planet.
It was on the planet,
Yeah.
but it was a cloud that was sparkly. It had like little lights.
It looked a
flaring
little
in
bit
it.
like throw up.
And that right with twinkling lights within it.
Yeah.
But in this case,
It came with that great music too. That it was like
there was
theremin type.
yes. Yeah, but it just wanted some companionship. But I think it could take other forms.
Yes.
Here, who knows? It's like all kinds of strange things happen, especially if you read the descriptions of St. Elmo's fire, which is a very rare occurrence. But ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, it's not been very well documented and recorded. I'm not sure if there's even any great photos of it, but it does happen. And again, it's not supernatural. It's just a natural weather atmospheric phenomenon. So the most extreme things that get your head wrapped around this, it's dealing with the truncation of space and time. Because again, as I said earlier, those are things that we count on to make sense of our world. And when those don't add up, it's very disturbing. It's very disconcerting.
I want to make a point here.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I heard, I can't remember, on NPR or something. Just last week, I was listening to somebody talking about physics and space and time.
Yeah.
And it was a little thing that popped out. And I was like, I have to tell our listeners this. And I just wanted to say it really quick. They had a guest on. I wish I could remember who it was that said it now. Shame on me for that. But he said that the big disconnect, because we talked in their past episode about the fact that quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity don't jibe.
Right.
They don't necessarily connect. And
Right. So there's no final grand unified theory of everything because they can't account for gravity and time.
Right. There's a disconnect between them. And what this gentleman said, who I seem to remember as somebody who was very well educated, was that the real problem between quantum theory and the theory of relativity is time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the monkey wrench. That's the
Right.
flaw in the ointment between those two theories. I just wanted to put that out there because it simplifies, probably oversimplifies, but I just thought that was interesting. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'd heard, things like it's a very specific and subjective experience, and there's no reason, according to physics, I believe, that time can't run backwards. It just doesn't. So it's just part of our experience.
Well, maybe because it doesn't exist.
Well, again, to get spiritual, we say this quite often, but it's a big philosophical and Buddhist theory. It's all one big now. There is no past. There is no
That's
future.
Einstein. I think he said that about time.
Right.
It's all happening at once.
Well, that quote is, yes, time happens so that everything doesn't happen at once, which that's how we have to experience it or we go insane. So again, time is an experience, but it's not quantifiable. It's like gravity, that's predictable with physics, but we don't know where it comes from or why it happens really. So you can't really include it in the theory of everything.
Right.
So yeah, that's a big stickler. But once we figure that out, maybe that opens up a whole new world to us.
All right, I want to read one more article here. This is another one that is from more recent times, 1975. This is
We're right in our wheelhouse of
yeah.
strange Bermuda Triangle, Bigfoot, UFO stuff.
This is from Florida Today, and this is kind of a famous incident, which some people will probably recognize when they hear it. The article is called Captain Recounts Escape. It is written by one Charles Berlitz.
Oh, he got around.
Yeah, this is a good one. The experience of Captain Don Henry in 1966 gives a graphic account of a tug of war, in quotes, between a towboat and an unidentified force attempting, consciously or unconsciously, to capture the barge. We were coming in on the return trip between Puerto Rico and Fort Lauderdale. We had been out for 3 days towing an empty barge which had carried petroleum nitrate. I was aboard the Good News, a 160-foot-long tug of 2,000 horsepower. The barge we were towing weighed 2,500 tons and was on a line 1,000 feet behind. We were on the tongue of the ocean. This is going to come up again in a minute.
Oh, that's right.
Also known as Toto.
Also known as AUTEC.
We were on the tongue of the ocean after coming through the Exumas. The depth was about 600 fathoms. It was afternoon, the weather was good, and the sky was clear. I had gone to the cabin and back of the bridge for a few minutes when I heard a lot of hollering going on. I came out of the cabin onto the bridge and yelled, "What the hell is going on?" The first thing I looked at was the compass, which was spinning clockwise. I did not know what had happened, but something big was sure as hell going on. This show tonight has a lot of HE double hockey sticks in it.
For you kids, yes.
Apologies.
What the heck is going on?
The water seemed to be coming from all directions. The horizon disappeared. We couldn't see where the horizon was. The water, sky, and horizon all blended together. We couldn't see where we were. Whatever was happening robbed, stole, or borrowed everything from our generators. All electric appliances and outlets ceased to produce power. The generators were still running, but we weren't getting any power. The engineer tried to start an auxiliary generator, but couldn't get a spark. I was worried about the tow. It was tight, but I couldn't see it. It seemed to be covered by a cloud, and around it the waves seemed to be more choppy than in other areas. I rammed the throttles full ahead. I couldn't see where we were going, but I wanted to get the hell out in a hurry. It seemed that something wanted to pull us back, but it couldn't quite make it. Coming out of it was like coming out of a fog bank. When we came out, the tow line was sticking out straight, like the Indian rope trick, with nothing visible at the end of it, where it was covered by a fog concentrated around it. I jumped to the main deck and pulled. The damn barge came out from the fog, but there was no fog anyplace else. In fact, I could see for 11 miles. In the foggy area where the tow should have been, the water was confused, although the waves were not big. Call me Nero, not hero. I wasn't going back to find out what it was that was back there.
Ooh.
As you can see, Mr. Berlitz has the gift of gab.
Yeah. Well, he writes a lot of books.
He does.
It's got a great ring of, he's a good storyteller.
Yeah.
The tow line is astern.
Yeah.
So behind them, something is pulling them back into this batch as cotton ball of fog.
Right. And maybe it was just magnetic energy. And it felt like it was pulling them back and they couldn't pull it out because the electronic fog, if that's what this was in this case, had such a strong draw on the barge itself that it took a 2,000 horsepower engine to get it pulled free.
Well, now, of course, I am totally rethinking what happened to the Mary Celeste in the tow line because it disappeared the Peoples.
Yeah.
Tow line was out. It was in a bit of disarray as if they'd gone through some kind of storm. And as we know, these types of strange phenomenon, even astrophysical phenomenon like the solar storm of 1859, which the Ark dug up and known as the Carrington event, was really massive. People saw sparks jumping on telegraph lines. And it can happen again. That's the other thing that people don't realize. There's not a whole lot you can do. But basically, it would send us back to the early 19th century. You might have gas lamps working. Everything else we know that is modern life would cease to function.
My iPhone?
Like this whole podcast, yes. But the good thing about it was that it's happening in 1859. Although people saw like poles and lines catching fire, it was so magnetically charged. The good thing is that there wasn't much in the way of electronics back then. So it didn't cause a huge amount of damage, although it was visible. Imagine that kind of freaking you out because it's not like a hurricane where you can see it or a tornado. It's relatively invisible except that you're seeing the effects of a massive solar flare, a coronal mass ejection event. And again, it can happen at any time, and if it does, we're kind of in a bit of trouble there. So with the Mary Celeste, I'm not sure that's the case. We do have a very strong Team Squid bent here.
Team Giant Squid.
Team Giant Squid.
Yeah.
But
it's not your regular calamari.
No, it is. You're a lot of sauce and breading with that one. But if you look at the instance, if that is true, Charles Berlitz's story about the tug, now that almost sounds sentient, something tugging on them, or it could just very well be some kind of phenomenon that is unexplainable.
Well, if it's electromagnetic and it's latching onto things, it could feel like it's sentient because it's being attracted to man-made things because they're made of metal.
Yeah, no,
So then it seems like it's out to get you.
Right. It's just,
but it's no more out to get you than the static shock when you walk across the carpet barefoot and touch your dog.
Yeah, exactly. That's not
on the nose usually.
Oh, that's kind of cruel. But the idea is that it's like with the chains. There's a bit of fear being added to this. So the perceptions of those experiencing it is shaded by the fact that they are terrorized and all this weird stuff is happening to them and they can't explain it.
Yeah.
Like not being able to pick up the chains.
All right, I want to touch on one last common ground incident here before we wrap up the show, and that is the Lindbergh incident, which is very well covered in the very introduction of Bruce Gernon's book. It's actually by Rob McGregor and Bruce Gernon. They wrote it together. It is called The Fog. I can recommend it. We got a lot of information from it, and you can find it online pretty easily. And his new book will be out in August of this year. We'll see if we can have him back on. If it's something about, I have a suspicion that it might be about time slips, not when you're clocking in or out to make a horrible joke twice.
Yeah.
All right, so listen to this. Just going to read a brief section here, 1 or 2 pages from Bruce's book about what happened to Lindbergh. Quote, "Nothing on my map of Florida corresponded with the Earth's features I had seen. Where could I be?" Those were the baffling words of Charles Lindbergh as he described a mysterious experience on a flight across the Caribbean through the heart of the Bermuda Triangle. Lindbergh took off at 1:35 a.m. on February 13th, 1928, on what for him should have been a routine flight, the last leg of his Around the Gulf and Caribbean tour. Or Caribbean, for those of you that are probably going to email.
Yes.
He intended to fly nonstop from Havana to St. Louis, which would be the first ever nonstop flight between the two cities. Quote, "It should have been an easy flight, about a third the distance from New York to Paris," he wrote in his autobiography. He climbed to an altitude of 4,000 feet and settled back to enjoy the night flight. But halfway across the Straits of Florida, my magnetic compass started rotating, and the Earth inductor compass needle jumped back and forth erratically. By that time, a haze had formed, screening off horizons. Only one other time had he seen 2 compasses fail at once. That was during a storm in the Atlantic en route to Paris, and his magnetic compass only oscillated back and forth, so he was able to calculate his direction by the central point of the oscillation. That's happened with me with the gas gauge in my dad's old British car.
Flipping around?
Yeah, it flips around, and you just kind of guess where the middle is.
I've seen the bouncing. I've seen bouncing gauges before, yes.
But this time in the Caribbean, the magnetic compass spun in circles and the inductor compass was useless. I had no idea whether I was flying north, south, east, or west. Lindbergh started climbing toward the clear sky that just minutes ago had been above him. If he could find Polaris, he could navigate by the stars. But the haze thickened as he climbed higher, so he descended to less than 1,000 feet, but the haze followed him and he could barely see the ocean. Ooh. Just before dawn, he spotted a shadowy island and assumed that he'd reached the Florida Keys. But after crossing a narrow body of water, Lindbergh saw a long coastline bending to the right, the opposite way the land curved on his map of Florida. But if I was not flying over a Florida Key, where could I be? Was it possible I had returned to Cuba, that my attempt to read the twirling compass had put me 180 degrees off course? The coastline ended and he saw more keys ahead. He realized that if he wasn't over the Florida Keys, he was above the Bahamas. That meant he'd been flying at a 90-degree angle from his proper heading, and that he was about 300 miles off course. Once the sun was high enough above the horizon, he determined east and headed through the haze in the opposite direction toward the Florida coast. The magnetic compass stopped rotating as soon as he reached the mainland. He passed by dozens of heavy squalls as he moved through Florida and Georgia and headed on to St. Louis to complete his flight. Possibly because of his renown as a pilot, Lindbergh never talked publicly about his strange experience in what was to become known as the Bermuda Triangle. He waited to reveal it in his autobiography, which was published 4 years after his death in 1978. All right. This is happening not just to Bruce. As Bruce said himself, he knew of other pilots, I think, in contemporary times, but we've also got the Lindbergh incident, and then we've got these maritime incidents that we've covered. All of them have strikingly similar things happening.
That's what I was mentioning before, is that the patterns of some kind of atmospheric magnetic cloud disturbance, or just simply something strange, a bank of some kind, that is affecting your instruments for one, your sense of direction, and just visibility. And so, yes, there's a common thread that runs through all of these stories, whether in the air or the sea. The stuff happening on land seems to be more about taking roadkill off to eat it somewhere 100 yards away. But the idea, though, that these experienced and skilled airmen and seamen are experiencing and describing very similar phenomenon tells me that there's something to this, that this phenomenon actually happens. And whether statistically it's not as much in the Bermuda Triangle, there does, to me, and at least anecdotally, but on a huge scale, something's going on down there.
Another thing I want pilots to understand, if they're caught in this electronic fog, only make one turn. and either turn to the mainland or turn to the main body of water. Because once you make 2 turns, you're going to start to lose your sense of direction. And then if you make 3, now you got to start guessing which way is north and south. You have absolutely no idea. Because once all the electronics go out, you can't navigate.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. We'll be back in 1 week with a show on the infamous disappearance of Flight 19.
We'd like to thank the Great Courses Plus, Squarespace, and ZipRecruiter for sponsoring the show. Please remember that supporting our sponsors supports Astonishing Legends.
Special thanks to John Bolin.
Hello, this is the Count of St. Germain, otherwise known as Kevin Pollak.
Hi, I'm Ian Ulam.
I'm Kristen DeWitt, and I give permission to Astonishing Legends to use my voice however they see fit, galaxy-wide in perpetuity. Or whatever.
Fantastic.
Our show is edited by Sarah Voorhees, and the theme is by Judson Crane.
Sound design is by Ryan McCullough.
Special thanks to the ARC and its lead researcher, Tess Feifel.
But most importantly, we want to thank our listeners. You can find us online at astonishinglegends.com, as well as Facebook, Patreon, Twitter, Tumblr, Google+, and Instagram.
Copyright Scott Philbrook
and Forrest Burgess. Good night.